Most people would say the syringe was an act of mercy. David, a veteran doctor from Seattle, certainly thought so. Standing in a warm cabin, holding the needle that would end the suffering of a paralyzed 19-year-old Bobcat, he believed he was doing the right thing, the logical thing. But logic has no place in a Montana blizzard, and it certainly had no power over Martha Sterling. When that dying animal dragged his broken body to the door, begging not for comfort, but for the storm, a 72-year-old woman made a decision that terrified her son. She didn't choose the warm rug. She didn't choose the easy way out. She chose to wrap a wild predator in her coat and walk into 20 below zero darkness. This isn't just a story about saying goodbye. It is the story of a suicide mission up a frozen mountain, a battle between safety and dignity. And the night a son learned that keeping someone alive isn't the same as loving them. The blizzard outside was not merely a weather event. It was a physical assault on the cabin. The wind hammered against the hand-hewn logs of the Montana homestead with a violence that made the heavy timbers groan in protest, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of David's boots. Inside, the air was suffocatingly warm, thick with the scent of burning pine from the stone hearth and the sharp, clinical odor of rubbing alcohol that David had just swabbed across the rubber stopper of the vial. David Sterling held the syringe up to the flickering light of the fire. The liquid inside was clear, harmless in appearance, yet it carried the weight of a final judgment. He was a veterinarian, a man of science and mercy, yet his hand trembled slightly as he tapped the plastic barrel to dislodge a tiny air bubble. He had performed this procedure hundreds of times in sterile clinics in Seattle, ending the suffering of golden retrievers with failing hearts and cats with terminal cancers. It was always heavy, but it was never this heavy. This was not a clinic. This was the home he had run away from 20 years ago. And the creature breathing raggedly on the buffalo hide rug was not a pet. "It's time, Mom," David said, his voice gentle but firm, trying to cut through the roar of the wind outside. He's drowning in his own fluids. You can hear it. Martha sat in the high-backed rocking chair, her silhouette carved from the shadows by the firelight. At 72, she looked as weathered and enduring as the mountains surrounding them. Her hands, gnarled by decades of chopping wood and mending fences, were clasped tightly in her lap. She did not look at her son. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the animal lying at her feet. Elias was a ruin of a king. At 19 years old, he was a biological anomaly for a bobcat, living nearly twice the lifespan nature intended for his kind. But time had finally come to collect its debt. The magnificent spotted coat, once thick and lustrous enough to repel the deepest snows, was now thin and patchy, revealing the sharp architecture of his ribs. His left ear was tattered, a souvenir from a coyote fight a decade ago. His right eye was gone, lost to a territory dispute. The socket healed over in a puckered scar. The remaining eye, a piercing amber orb, was clouded with cataracts and pain. He lay on his side, his chest hitching with every shallow inspiration. The kidney failure had paralyzed his hindquarters 3 days ago, dragging his proud haunches into useless dead weight. To David, the diagnosis was absolute. There was no recovery, only the prolonged agony of a body shutting down system by system. The syringe was not a weapon, it was a gift. "He hasn't eaten in 4 days, David," Martha whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping over stone. "He hasn't drunk water since yesterday morning. That's why we have to do this." David knelt beside the rug, the floorboards cold against his knees. He moved with practiced efficiency, reaching out to shave a small patch of fur on the bobcat's front leg to find the vein. It will be instant, like falling asleep. He won't feel the pain anymore. The kidneys stop, the heart slows, and he just drifts away. David reached out to touch the animal. The moment his fingers grazed the coarse fur, a low, rumbling vibration started in the bobcat's chest. It wasn't a purr, it was a growl, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Despite the paralysis, despite the toxins flooding his blood, Elias snapped his head up. The one amber eye locked onto David with a ferocity that made the man recoil instinctively. The bobcat bared his teeth, yellowed, worn down, but still lethal weapons. He did not look like a dying patient. He looked like a cornered monarch refusing to abdicate his throne. "Easy, old man," David soothed, his heart rate spiking. "I'm trying to help you." "He doesn't want your help, David," Martha said. And for the first time, she looked at her son. Her eyes were dry, devoid of the tears David had expected. Instead, there was a burning intensity in them that mirrored the animal's. "He hates being inside. You know that. He only came in when the temperature dropped to 40 below, and even then, he slept in the rafters." David sighed, frustration warring with sympathy. "Mom, look outside. It's 20 degrees below zero. The wind chill is lethal. If I put him out there, he freezes to death in minutes. Is that better? Is that how you want him to go? Shivering and alone in the dark?" "He is a wild animal," Martha stated, as if that explained everything. "He was wild once," David corrected, gesturing with the syringe. "Now he is a geriatric patient in acute renal failure. Please, Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Let him have some dignity. Dignity." The word hung in the air between them. David moved again, determined to finish this. He needed to find the vein. He reached for the front paw again, firmly this time, intending to restrain the animal. What happened next defied every medical textbook David had ever studied. Elias, the creature whose hind legs were supposedly useless dead weight, the animal who hadn't the strength to lift his head an hour ago, exploded into motion. With a snarl that was more scream than growl, he twisted his torso, his front claws flashing out. He didn't strike David, though he could have easily severed the radial artery. Instead, he used the momentum to drag himself away. "Elias!" Martha gasped, half rising from her chair. The bobcat dragged his body across the rough floorboards. It was a grotesque, agonizing display of willpower. His back legs dragged behind him like anchors, lifeless and heavy. But his front shoulders, massive and muscular from a lifetime of climbing pines and bringing down deer, churned like pistons. He hauled himself foot by excruciating foot, his claws digging into the wood, leaving deep gouges in the pine. "Stop him," David said, scrambling up, capping the needle to avoid an accident. "He's going to hurt himself." But David didn't move to stop him. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the scene. The animal was crawling toward the far wall of the cabin, toward the large sliding glass door that looked out onto the porch. Outside, the storm was a white vortex. The snow smashed against the glass, piling up in drifts that reached halfway up the pane. The world beyond that glass was death incarnate, a frozen hell that would kill a healthy man in an hour, let alone a dying animal. Elias reached the glass. He collapsed for a moment, his sides heaving violently, his pink tongue lolling out. David took a step forward, relief washing over him. The exertion had surely finished him. Now he could administer the sedative. But then the bobcat raised a trembling paw. The sound was hideous, keratin scraping against tempered glass. Elias struck the window. Then again. He wasn't attacking his reflection. He was digging. He was trying to claw his way through the invisible barrier. He let out a sound that David had never heard from a feline throat, a high, desperate, keening wail that harmonized with the shrieking wind outside. It was a sound of absolute, crushing despair. He didn't want to be comforted. He didn't want the soft rug. He didn't want the warmth. He wanted the storm. Elias hauled himself up, balancing precariously on his front paws, pressing his face against the freezing glass. He stared out into the white void, with a longing so profound it made David's chest ache. The animal turned his head, looking back at the two humans. The aggression was gone. In that single amber eye, David saw something that terrified him more than the teeth or the claws. He saw pleading, not for life, but for the right to choose his death. He's not confused, David. Martha stood up fully now, her shadow stretching long and distorted across the room. She walked past her son, past the fire, moving toward the door where the dying king scratched weakly at his glass cage. He knows exactly what is out there. Mom, David's voice cracked. You can't be serious. You can't open that door. The heat will suck out of here in seconds. And he won't make it past the porch steps. Martha stopped at the coat rack. She didn't answer him. She reached for her heavy sheepskin coat, the one that smelled of lanolin and wood smoke. She pulled it on, buttoning it with slow, deliberate movements. Then she reached for her scarf. Mom? David took a step forward, the syringe still clutched in his hand like a useless talisman of civilization. What are you doing? Martha turned to him. Her face was set in stone, her jaw tight. She looked at the syringe in his hand with something bordering on contempt. He's lived 19 years as the master of this valley, Martha said, her voice steely calm. He fought coyotes for this land. He survived famines. He survived the trap that took his eye. I will not let him die scratching at a window like a trapped house cat. She walked to the sliding door. Elias looked up at her, and the thrashing of his tail ceased. He knew. Put that needle in the fire, David, Martha commanded, her hand hovering over the latch of the door. The wind outside roared louder, as if sensing an invitation. We are going for a walk. You'll die, David whispered, the reality of her intention crashing down on him. Mom, you can't carry him. You're 72. It's a blizzard. Then I guess we die together, Martha said. And with a decisive jerk of her wrist, she unlocked the latch. The door slid open. The roar of the storm exploded into the cabin, instantly extinguishing the silence, bringing with it a blast of air so cold it felt like a physical blow. The fire in the hearth flared wildly, shadows dancing in panic. Elias didn't wait. With a surge of strength that should not have existed, he dragged his broken body over the threshold, plunging chest deep into the snow, into the night, into the storm that was waiting to claim him. Martha stepped out after him, into the white oblivion. The cold did not arrive in degrees. It arrived as a solid, crushing weight. The moment David stepped past the threshold of the cabin, the air in his lungs crystallized, turning every breath into a jagged inhalation of crushed glass. The warmth of the hearth, the smell of pine, the safety of the indoors. It was all stripped away in a heartbeat, replaced by a screaming void of white noise and stinging ice. Mom, David screamed, but the wind tore the word from his lips and scattered it into the darkness before it could reach her. He stumbled off the porch, sinking immediately up to his knees in a drift that had formed against the stairs. The shock of the temperature was absolute. It was 20 degrees below zero, a temperature where exposed skin could freeze in minutes, where mechanical engines seized and where logic dictated that no living thing should be moving. Yet, 10 yards ahead of him, a shape was fighting its way through the snow. Martha was not walking. She was wading. The snow churned around her waist like angry surf. She had scooped Elias up from the drift where he had plunged. The Bobcat, dead weight in her arms, was wrapped clumsily in the folds of her oversized sheepskin coat, only the tip of a tattered ear visible against the storm. David lunged forward, his movement clumsy in his heavy boots. Panic, cold and sharp as the ice crystals lashing his face, flooded his system. This was insanity. This was how people died in Montana, confused, hypothermic, wandering off into the white until their hearts simply stopped beating. He couldn't let her do this. He was the doctor. He was the son. He was the one who made the rational decisions. He caught up to her near the woodpile, grabbing her shoulder with a force born of desperation. He spun her around. "Get back inside." He roared over the gale, his face inches from hers. "Are you trying to kill yourself? Look at him, Mom. He's done." Martha's face was already pale, her lips taking on a bluish tint, but her eyes were blazing with a terrifying clarity. She didn't stumble. She stood planted in the snow like an old cedar root, immovable. "Let go of me, David," she said. Her voice was not a scream, but a low, hard command that cut through the wind. "No." David tightened his grip on her coat. In his other hand, he realized he was still clutching the syringe, the plunger half depressed, the lethal mercy still trapped inside the plastic barrel. He held it up, shaking it in front of her face. "We can end it right here. If you won't go inside, I'll do it here. Just let me give him the shot. It takes 10 seconds, Mom. 10 seconds, and he goes to sleep. Don't drag him up a mountain to die in agony." The wind howled, a mournful, shrieking sound that seemed to rise from the throat of the valley itself. In Martha's arms, the bundle of fur shifted. Elias, the creature who had been dragging his paralyzed legs only moments ago, let out a sound. It wasn't a whimper of pain. It was a hiss, low, defiant, and filled with an ancient, simmering rage. Martha looked at the syringe, then up at her son's eyes. The look she gave him was one of profound disappointment, a look that made David feel suddenly very small, despite his medical degree and his city success. "You think you are saving him from pain," Martha shouted, the wind whipping her gray hair across her face. "You city doctors, you think pain is the only enemy. You measure life in heartbeats and breath sounds. You don't measure it in pride. Pride doesn't matter when your kidneys are failing," David argued, though his certainty was beginning to fracture under her gaze. "He is an animal, Mom. He doesn't know about pride. He knows he is cold and hurting." "He is not a dog, David." Martha stepped closer, forcing David to step back. "He is a bobcat. He is a solitary hunter. For 15 years, he never let me touch him unless he initiated it. He never ate from a bowl. He never slept on a cushion. He lived by his own laws." She adjusted the weight of the animal in her arms. The snow was piling up on her shoulders, turning her into a ghost. "Do you remember when you were 12? She asked, the question sudden and jarring in the chaos of the storm. "Do you remember when you found that hawk with the broken wing?" David blinked, the memory surfacing through the cold. "What does that have to do with this?" "You put it in a cage," Martha continued, her voice relentless. "You fed it mice. You gave it water. You kept it warm. You kept it alive for 3 years. And every single day of those 3 years, that hawk threw itself against the wire until its beak was bloody. It hated you, David. It hated the food. It hated the warmth. It wanted the sky, even if the sky meant death. She looked down at the head of the bobcat tucked against her chest. Elias is fighting the cage, David, not the death. The cage. He chose this. He crawled to the door. He chose the storm. David looked at the syringe in his hand. The clear liquid seemed suddenly obscene against the backdrop of the violent, majestic night. He looked at his mother, shivering violently but standing tall, holding the dying predator as if he were a crown jewel. "Where?" David asked, his voice breaking. "Where are you taking him?" "The burnt oak," Martha said, turning her gaze toward the invisible tree line where the forest climbed the ridge. "Where the lightning struck. It's his lookout. It's where he sat every morning to watch the valley. It's his throne." "That's a mile away," David choked out. "Uphill. In deep powder. You'll never make it." "Then I will fall trying," Martha said. "But I will not carry him back into that house to die on a rug like an invalid." She turned her back on him. It was the most final gesture David had ever seen. She turned away from safety, away from warmth, away from her son, and began to trudge toward the darkness of the tree line. David stood alone by the woodpile. The cold was seeping through his jacket now, biting into his skin, numbing his fingers. He looked at the syringe one last time. The symbol of his control. The symbol of his ability to fix things, to sanitize death, to make everything clean and painless. With a scream of frustration that was lost in the wind, David hurled the syringe into the darkness. He watched it spin away, a piece of plastic trash swallowed by the blizzard. He couldn't stop her. He knew that now. Martha Sterling was as much a part of this mountain as the granite beneath the snow. She would die before she broke her word to that animal. And if he stayed here, on the porch, safe and warm, he would survive. He would live to go back to Seattle, to his sterile clinic, to his orderly life. But he would never be able to look at himself in the mirror again. He would be the son who let his mother walk into the ice alone. David turned and ran back toward the cabin, not to stay, but to the mudroom. He slammed the door against the wind, the sudden silence of the interior deafening. His breath came in ragged gasps. He moved with a frantic speed, grabbing his heavy parka, the one he hadn't worn since high school. He snatched the high-beam flashlight from the shelf. He grabbed the lever-action rifle from the rack, not to shoot, but because, in this country, you didn't walk into the dark unarmed, not with the mountain lions and the desperation of winter. He pulled his hat down low, shoved his hands into heavy gloves, and grabbed a coil of rope. He paused for 1 second, looking at the fire dying in the hearth, the empty rocking chair, the rug where the bobcat had lain. "Damn it," he whispered. He threw the door open again and plunged back into the hellscape. He could just barely see her tracks, rapidly filling with fresh snow, leading away from the house and into the suffocating embrace of the forest. He lowered his head, clicked on the light, and began to run. The forest was not merely dark. It was a living, shifting entity of shadows and ice. The beam of David's flashlight cut a frantic, cone-shaped tunnel through the falling snow, illuminating only swirling white flakes and the ghostly trunks of lodgepole pines. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The snow concealed hidden roots and sudden dips in the terrain, forcing David to lift his knees high, his breath tearing out of his throat in ragged, visible clouds. He was following the tracks of a woman 20 years his senior, yet he was the one struggling to keep pace. Martha moved with a terrifying, single-minded rhythm. She did not look back. She did not pause to adjust the burden in her arms. She was a dark shape against the white, a force of nature moving through a catastrophe of nature. David pushed forward, the cold finding the gaps in his scarf, stinging his neck like invisible wasps. As he closed the distance, the beam of his light washed over Martha's left hand, the one clutching the collar of her sheepskin coat to keep Elias covered. The glove had slipped slightly, exposing a strip of pale, wrinkled skin at her wrist. Even in the chaotic light, David saw the scar. It was a jagged white line that ran from the base of her thumb halfway up her forearm, thick and raised, like a branding iron mark. It was an old wound, healed decades ago. But seeing it now, amidst this frozen madness, sent a jolt of memory through David that was colder than the wind. He knew that scar. He remembered the day she got it. He remembered the blood on the kitchen floor, so much blood that he, a grown man visiting from college, had nearly fainted. That was the beginning. That was the debt. The year was 2008. David had been home for Thanksgiving, trying to convince his mother to sell the land and move closer to civilization. She had ignored him, as usual, spending her mornings checking the perimeter fences. She had returned that afternoon, not with a turkey, but with her arm wrapped in a blood-soaked flannel shirt and a look in her eyes that David had never seen before. It wasn't a dog, she had said while David frantically tried to clean the wound, his hands shaking as he reached for the sutures. It was a devil. She had found him in the Devil's Gulch, a narrow ravine on the edge of her property. He wasn't a kitten. He was 4 years old, a prime male bobcat in the peak of his physical power, weighing nearly 40 pounds of coiled muscle and hate. He had stepped into an illegal steel-jaw leg-hold trap set by poachers. Most animals, when trapped, succumb to a frantic, exhausting panic. They chew their own legs off or die of stress. But not this one. When Martha had approached him, he hadn't cowered. He had been lying flat, waiting. He was in agony, the rusted iron teeth crushing the bones of his foreleg. But he had turned that pain into a weapon. Martha had told David the story later, her voice devoid of sentiment. She had approached with a heavy blanket, intending to cover his head and release the spring. It was a suicide mission for anyone untrained, but Martha respected the wilderness too much to leave a creature to rot. She threw the blanket. The bobcat moved faster than thought. He exploded from the ground, the trap weighing him down but not stopping him. He didn't try to run away. He tried to kill the thing that dared to approach him. His free claws slashed through the wool, finding the flesh of her arm, tearing it open to the muscle. Any other human would have retreated. Any other human would have gone back for a gun and ended it from a safe distance. But Martha didn't retreat. Adrenaline flooding her system, ignoring the arterial spray of her own blood, she had thrown her body weight onto the trap springs. She screamed at him, not in fear, but in a primal roar of her own, asserting dominance. She forced the jaws open. "Go!" she had shrieked. "Go and die somewhere else." The cat had pulled his mangled leg free. He stood there, three-legged, panting, blood dripping from his claws, her blood. He looked at her. He looked at the open trap. He looked at the woman clutching her ruined arm. He didn't run. That was the detail that haunted David for 15 years. The cat didn't bolt. He stood his ground for 10 long seconds, his amber eyes locking onto hers. He was assessing her. He was acknowledging that this two-legged creature, bleeding and screaming, was the only reason he was still standing. Then, with a silent, fluid turn, he vanished into the underbrush. "He'll die of infection," David had told her that night as he stitched her arm up. "Or he won't be able to hunt. Nature will take care of him." "Maybe," Martha had replied, staring out the dark window. "But he won't die in a trap." 3 months later, in the dead of winter, David received a photo on his phone. It was taken through the kitchen window. There, sitting on the railing of the porch, was the Bobcat. He was thinner, his fur matted with ice. His left leg was scarred and slightly crooked, but it bore weight. And his face was changed. The right eye was gone, a fresh, raw socket from some unseen battle during his absence. He had survived the trap. He had survived the infection. He had survived the winter. And he had returned. He didn't come for food. Martha never put out bowls. That would have been an insult. He came to sit. He sat on the porch for an hour, watching the house, watching Martha watch him. When she opened the door, he didn't approach to rub against her legs. He simply held his ground, blinked his remaining eye, and then turned to groom his shoulder. It was a treaty. An unspoken pact between two survivors who preferred solitude but recognized a kindred spirit. For 15 years, that pact had held. He protected her garden from deer. She protected his forest from hunters. They lived parallel lives, intersecting only in silence. David stumbled on a buried root, the jolt bringing him back to the brutal present. The snow was deeper here, waist-high in drifts. The memory of that fierce, trap-breaking predator clashed violently with the reality of the frail, dying weight in Martha's arms. The king of the Devil's Gulch was now just a bundle of failing organs and brittle bones. But as David looked at his mother's back, seeing her push through a wall of wind that would have stopped a linebacker, he realized something. She wasn't paying a debt of affection. She wasn't doing this because he was cute or because he was a pet. She was doing this because of that moment in the ravine 15 years ago. He had spared her throat when he could have taken it. She had given him freedom when she could have given him a bullet. They had saved each other's lives that day. And now she was fulfilling the final clause of their contract. She was ensuring that the creature who refused to die in a steel trap would not die in a glass one. "Mom," David shouted, his voice raw. "The incline, it gets steep here." Martha didn't slow down. She adjusted Elias, pulling him higher against her chest, shielding his remaining eye from the biting ice. "I know," she shouted back, her voice swallowed by the gale. "He knows the way." David shined the light ahead. The ground rose sharply, a wall of white leading up to the ridge. It was madness. It was suicide. And it was the most beautiful, terrible thing David had ever seen. He tightened his grip on the rifle, lowered his head, and stepped into her footprints, following the trail of blood and honor that had started 15 years ago. The mountain did not welcome them. In the summer, the trail to the burnt oak was a strenuous but scenic hike. A ribbon of dirt winding through lodgepole pines and columbine flowers. But in the grip of a blizzard, the trail had ceased to exist. The landscape had been erased, smoothed over by a relentless white trowel that filled in hollows and disguised drop-offs, turning the familiar slope into a minefield of hidden fractures. David pushed forward, his thighs burning with the lactic acid of exertion. The snow was no longer waist-deep. Here, where the wind had sculpted massive drifts against the spine of the ridge, it was chest-high in places. He was swimming through powder that felt less like water and more like concrete that set the moment you stopped moving. Ahead of him, Martha was a study in terrifying resilience. She had fallen twice in the last 100 yards. Each time she had gone down slowly, curling her body around the bundle in her arms to protect Elias from the impact. And each time, before David could scramble to her side to help, she had risen. It was a mechanical, jerky resurrection, fueled not by muscle, but by a reserve of willpower that David, for all his medical training, could not quantify. He checked his watch, peeling back the frozen sleeve of his parka. The crystal was frosted over. He rubbed it with his thumb. They had been out here for 40 minutes. In these conditions, 40 minutes was a lifetime. The core body temperature would be dropping. Vasoconstriction would be pulling blood from the extremities to protect the vital organs. Fingers and toes would be going numb, then painful, then silent. "Mom!" David yelled, his voice snatched away by the gale the instant it left his lips. "We have to rest. Just for a minute." Martha didn't stop. She didn't even turn her head. She just kept driving her boots into the slope, carving a path for the dying king in her arms. David gritted his teeth and lunged forward, closing the gap between them. He reached out and grabbed the back of her coat, hauling her to a halt. She spun around, her eyes wild, her eyebrows thick with ice. "Let go," she hissed, her voice sounding like tearing paper. "Look at me," David shouted, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her slightly. "Look at my face, Mom. We are crossing the frost line. If we don't catch our breath, your heart is going to give out before we even reach the tree line." Martha stared at him. For a second, the adrenaline seemed to recede, leaving behind the stark reality of her age. She sagged slightly in his grip. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, the skin pale and waxy, the lines around her mouth deep valleys of fatigue. "He's getting heavy, David," she whispered, the admission costing her more than the climb. He feels heavier than he should." David looked down at the bundle. Elias was still. Too still. "Let me see him," David said, reaching for the flap of the sheepskin coat. "No, the cold will—" "Let me see him," David insisted, peeling back the wool. The bobcat was curled into a tight ball, his nose tucked under his tail. His breathing was shallow, rapid flutters that barely lifted his ribs. But his eye, that single cloudy amber eye, was open. He wasn't looking at David. He wasn't looking at Martha. He was looking up, past the folds of the coat, toward the swirling blackness of the sky. He was waiting. David covered him back up. "Quickly, he's still with us." "But barely." "Then we move," Martha said, her voice hardening again. She turned to face the slope. "The oak is just past that ridge. Maybe 200 yards. 200 yards. On a track, that was a sprint. Here it was an odyssey." They started again. The gradient increased sharply. This was the chimney, a narrow chute of rock that channeled the wind like a wind tunnel. The snow here was scoured away, leaving behind slick, treacherous ice hidden under a dusting of powder. David took the lead now, using his body to break the wind for his mother. He kicked his boots into the ice, creating steps, reaching back to pull her up. It was a grueling, slow-motion dance. Kick, step, pull, kick, step, pull. Suddenly, the ground beneath David's right foot gave way. It wasn't rock, it was a cornice, a shelf of snow hanging over empty air. With a sickening crump sound, the ledge sheared off. David fell. He didn't fall far, perhaps 10 feet into a depression filled with soft snow, but the suddenness of it disoriented him. He landed on his back, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the hole in the world he had just made. "David!" Martha's scream pierced the wind. He scrambled to sit up, spitting snow. I'm okay. Stay there." He looked up. Martha was kneeling at the edge of the drop, peering down. In her panic, she had shifted her grip on Elias. The bobcat, sensing the chaos, sensing the fall, began to thrash. It was the last surge of a dying predator's instinct, the fear of falling. Elias twisted violently in the coat. "No, Elias, no!" Martha cried out, struggling to hold him. But the coat was slippery with snow, and her gloves were thick and clumsy. The bobcat kicked out with his paralyzed back legs, a spasm of nerves, and his heavy front paws scrambled for purchase. He slid from her grasp. David watched in horror as the animal tumbled over the edge. Elias hit the snow next to David with a soft thud. He didn't land on his feet. His paralyzed hindquarters prevented that grace. He landed on his side, sprawling awkwardly in the deep powder. For a moment, there was stillness. Then, the bobcat let out a sound that tore David's heart in two. It was a low, confused growl of humiliation. He tried to stand, his front legs clawing at the snow, dragging his useless rear end, trying to right himself, trying to regain some shred of dignity in this white hell. "Don't move him," Martha yelled, sliding down the slope on her backside, ignoring the danger to herself. She tumbled into the drift beside David and scrambled toward the cat. She reached for him, but Elias snapped at her. He hissed, baring his teeth, his ears flattened against his skull. He swiped at the air, keeping her back. "He's hurt," David said, moving to flank him. "The fall might have—" "He's not hurt," Martha said, stopping her hand mid-reach. She sat back on her heels in the snow, her breathing ragged. "He's ashamed." David looked at the animal. Elias had stopped thrashing. He was lying in the snow, panting, the ice crystals beginning to coat his fur. He wasn't snapping because of pain. He was snapping because he had been dropped, because he was helpless, because for a creature who had ruled this mountain, lying broken in a snowdrift was a fate worse than death. The wind howled around them in the depression, creating a strange, swirling vortex of noise. "He can't walk," David said softly. "And you can't carry him up that ice, Mom. You don't have the strength. If you slip again, you both go down the real ravine." Martha looked up at the ridge. The dark shape of the tree line was visible now, agonizingly close, yet separated from them by a wall of ice and gravity. She looked back at Elias. Tears, hot and fast, tracked through the ice on her cheeks. "I promised him," she choked out. "I promised him the view." David looked at his mother, a woman who had fought the world for this land, for this life. Then he looked at the bobcat, a creature who had fought steel traps and winter starvation. He realized then that he was the only variable in this equation that had not yet been tested. He was the only one with strength left to give. David unslung the rifle from his shoulder and shoved it barrel down into the snow to mark their position. He took off his heavy gloves, stuffing them into his pockets, needing the dexterity of his bare hands despite the biting cold. "You can't carry him," David said, his voice steady. "So I will." Martha looked at him, confusion clouding her eyes. "He won't let you. He doesn't trust you. He'll tear you apart." "He knows I'm the one with the needle," David said, stepping forward. "He knows I'm the enemy." He knelt in front of the snarling bobcat. He didn't try to soothe him. He didn't use the soft, good kitty voice. He lowered his head, making eye contact, locking gazes with the one-eyed king. "I'm not going to kill you down here, Elias," David said, speaking man to animal, hunter to hunter. "But you have to let me help you up. You want the ridge? I'm the only legs you've got left." Elias growled, a low rumble that vibrated the snow. He watched David's hands. David moved slowly. He didn't reach for the scruff of the neck. He reached underneath, sliding his hands under the bobcat's chest and belly. He felt the heat of the animal's body, a burning furnace of life fighting against the encroaching cold. He felt the rapid, fluttery beat of the heart. Elias stiffened, his claws extended, sharp hooks hovering inches from David's wrists. One swipe could open David's veins. David didn't flinch. He held the weight, waiting for permission. For 5 agonizing seconds, the man and the beast remained frozen in a tableau of tension. Then, slowly, the growl faded. Elias exhaled. His claws retracted. He leaned his weight into David's palms, It was a surrender, not of pride, but of necessity. David lifted him. He was heavier than he looked, a density of bone and muscle that illness couldn't erase. David stood up, cradling the bobcat against his chest, ignoring the smell of sickness, focusing only on the warmth. "Grab my coat, Mom," David commanded, turning to the ice slope. "Hold on to my belt. We go up together, or we don't go at all." Martha scrambled up, wiping her face. She grabbed the back of David's parka with a grip of iron. "Ready," she whispered. David kicked his boot into the ice, finding a foothold. He began to climb. He carried the weight of the dying king in his arms and the weight of his mother on his back, ascending step by brutal step into the white void. The ridge was not a peak, but a plateau. A flat, exposed anvil of granite where the wind accelerated to hurricane speeds, screaming across the open expanse with nothing to break its momentum. When David finally crested the ice chute, his boots finding purchase on the level ground, he didn't feel triumph. He felt a hollowness that threatened to cave his chest in. He collapsed to his knees, the impact jarring his spine. He was still clutching Elias against his chest. The bobcat was a solid, vibrating weight of heat inside his parka. The animal had stopped growling. He was now limp, his head resting heavily on David's forearm, his breathing a series of wet, rattling hitches that David could feel through the layers of Gore-Tex and wool. Martha crawled up beside them a moment later. She didn't stand. She simply rolled onto her back in the snow, staring up at the swirling void, her chest heaving violently. Her face was a map of hypothermia, waxy, pale, with patches of bright, dangerous red on her cheekbones. We made it to the flats," Martha gasped, her voice barely audible. "The oak is just through the timber." David looked at the dark smudge of trees 100 yards ahead. It was close, but the rage that had been building in him since he threw the syringe into the dark suddenly boiled over, hot and scalding against the freezing air. "Why?" David asked. He didn't shout it. He spat it out like a piece of poison. Martha turned her head, her eyes glassy. "David." "Why are we doing this, Mom?" David yelled, his voice cracking. He looked down at the dying animal in his arms. "I get the dignity part. I get the wild spirit part. But you are killing yourself for him, literally killing yourself. You're 72 years old, and you're crawling through a blizzard for a cat that would have eaten your corpse if you died in the woods." "He wouldn't," Martha whispered. "You don't know that," David roared, the wind snatching his anger and whipping it around them. "He's an animal. But I'm your son. I'm your flesh and blood." He shifted Elias, feeling the absurdity of the situation. "Do you remember when I left? Do you remember the day I drove to Seattle?" Martha flinched. "It wasn't from the cold. I stood on that porch for an hour waiting for you to ask me to stay," David said, the words tumbling out, raw and unpolished. "I wanted you to tell me that you needed me, that the ranch was too much work, that you didn't want to be alone. But you just shook my hand. You shook my hand like I was a neighbor selling a tractor. You told me to drive safe." Tears that had nothing to do with the wind froze on David's lashes. "You let your only son walk away without a fight. But for this cat, you're willing to die. You're willing to walk into a meat grinder." He looked at Elias, sleeping fitfully in his arms. "I was jealous of him, Mom, for 20 years. I saw the photos you sent. I saw him on the porch. I saw him in the garden. He took my place. He was the son who stayed." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the snow. It was the ugly, naked truth that David had hidden behind his medical degree and his busy city life. He wasn't just angry about the danger. He was angry because he felt replaced by a creature that couldn't even speak her name. Martha slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position. She reached out, her gloved hand trembling, and pulled down the scarf that covered her neck. "David," she said softly. "Look." David looked. Beneath the heavy wool of her collar, just below the jawline on the left side of her neck, was a scar. It wasn't like the jagged tear on her arm. This was a burn scar, smooth, shiny, and puckered. David frowned. "I remember that. I did that. I was 10. I was playing with the branding iron in the barn. I tripped." "You tripped?" Martha nodded. "You burned me. It was an accident. I never blamed you." "I know," David said, confused. "But what does that have to do with this? Do you remember the winter after you left for Seattle? The big freeze of '98? David nodded. The news had reported cattle dying standing up in the fields. "I slipped on the ice that January," Martha said, her voice steady, devoid of self-pity. "I was walking back from the barn. I fell and broke my hip. I couldn't move. I couldn't reach the phone. I lay in the snow for 6 hours before the county plow came by and saw me." David's blood ran cold. "You never told me that. You told me you had the flu. I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to come back out of guilt." Martha reached out and touched the Bobcat's head, her fingers brushing the frosted ears. It was 10 below zero. "I was freezing to death, David. I could feel my heart stopping. I closed my eyes, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to die looking at the barn roof." She looked at Elias with a reverence that bordered on worship. Then he came. David looked down at the bundle in his arms. "He didn't come to eat me," Martha said fiercely. "He came out of the woods. He walked right up to me. I thought he was going to attack. But he didn't. He climbed onto my chest. He curled up right here." She tapped the scar on her neck. He laid his body over the artery. He pressed his belly against my core, and he stayed there. The wind shrieked around them, but David suddenly couldn't hear it. "He snarled at the crows," Martha whispered. "He kept the coyotes away. He shared his heat with me for 6 hours. He purred, David. The only time in 19 years he ever purred was when I was dying in the snow. He kept my blood warm enough to keep moving. He saved the mother you left behind." David looked down at Elias. The Bobcat was no longer just a patient. He was no longer just a wild animal. He was the keeper of the watch. He was the guardian who had stepped in when David had stepped out. The jealousy that had rotted in David's gut for 2 decades evaporated, replaced by a crushing wave of shame. He hadn't been replaced. He had been covered for. This creature hadn't stolen his mother's love. He had preserved his mother's life. David shifted his grip, pulling Elias tighter against him, not to restrain him, but to embrace him. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against the coarse, wet fur of the animal's flank. "I didn't know," David whispered into the fur. "I'm sorry, old man. I didn't know." Elias stirred. He didn't growl. He let out a long, ragged exhale, and for a brief second, he pushed his head up against David's chin. It was a weak pressure, barely there, but it was an acknowledgement. "We are not enemies. We are just 2 males protecting the same woman." Martha reached out and took David's hand. Her grip was weak, but her skin was still warm. "He's dying, David," she said. "He held on for me. Now I have to hold on for him." David nodded. He stood up. The fatigue in his legs was still there, but the heaviness in his heart was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was a singular, crystal-clear purpose. He looked at the dark line of trees ahead. The burnt oak waited. "Let's get him to his throne," David said. He turned and began to walk, his stride longer now, driven by a new kind of strength, the strength of a son who finally understood the cost of his absence and the value of the beast who had paid it. The transition from the exposed granite plateau to the tree line was abrupt, like stepping from the deck of a storm-tossed ship into the hush of a cathedral. As David and Martha crossed the threshold of the timber, the screaming wind that had battered them for the last hour was suddenly severed by the dense wall of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed against David's eardrums, a suffocating vacuum where the only sounds were the ragged pistons of their own lungs and the dry, squeaking crunch of snow compressing under their boots. Here, in the belly of the forest, the darkness was absolute. The flashlight beam danced erratically, illuminating ancient tree trunks that twisted upward into a canopy so thick it blotted out the swirling sky. The snow was different here, too. It wasn't the hard-packed ice of the ridge. It was deep, soft powder, sugar snow, the locals called it, that offered no resistance and no support. David struggled. With every step, he sank to his mid-thigh, the hidden lattice of fallen, branches beneath the snow snagging at his ankles like skeletal hands. Elias was a leaden weight in his arms, his body heat beginning to fade, his breathing now just a faint, irregular tremor against David's chest. "Stay close, Mom," David wheezed, pausing to rip his leg free from a drift. "The trail is gone. We have to navigate by the slope." There was no answer. David spun around, the flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc through the gloom. "Mom?" Martha was standing 10 feet behind him. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking up at the gnarled branches of a dead pine tree, her head tilted to the side, a strange, dreamy smile playing on her lips. She had stopped shivering. David's stomach dropped. He knew the symptoms. He had seen them in textbooks, and he had seen them in the emergency room during his residency. The shivering stops when the body gives up the fight to stay warm. The confusion sets in as the brain, starved of oxygen and warmth, begins to misfire. "Mom," David barked, the harshness of his voice shattering the stillness. He lunged back toward her, the snow dragging at his legs. Martha blinked slowly, turning her gaze to him. Her eyes were unfocused, the pupils dilated. "The coffee is ready, David," she said, her voice conversational, shocking in its normalcy. "I put the pot on. Don't let the toast burn." "No, Mom." David grabbed her shoulders with his free hand, shaking her hard. "We aren't in the kitchen. We're in the woods. We're going to the oak. Stay with me." "It's so warm in here," Martha murmured, her hands fumbling with the buttons of her coat. She began to undo the top toggle. "I don't need this heavy thing. It's stifling." "Stop it!" David screamed, slapping her hands away. The paradoxical undressing, the final, fatal stage of hypothermia, where the nerves burn with a false sensation of heat. If she took that coat off, she would be dead in 10 minutes. "Keep it on. You are freezing to death, Mom. Fight it." He grabbed her face between his hand and the bulk of the bobcat's body, forcing her to look at him. Her skin was like marble, cold, hard, and gray. "Elias needs you." David used the only weapon he had left. "We haven't reached the tree yet. He's still waiting. Don't you quit on him now." The name seemed to spark a flicker of recognition in the fog of her mind. Martha's eyes cleared for a second. The smile vanished, replaced by a grimace of pain as the reality of the cold rushed back in. "Elias," she whispered. "The tree." "Yes." "Grab my belt," David commanded, his voice trembling with terror. "Do not let go. If you let go, I can't come back for you. Do you understand?" Martha nodded weakly. She reached out, her stiff fingers hooking clumsily into the back of David's belt. They moved on, a pathetic, shambling train. David was exhausted beyond measure. His arms burned from carrying the 40-pound animal. His legs felt like they were filled with lead shot. The forest seemed to be conspiring against them, the trees crowding. Closer, the shadows lengthening into distorting shapes that looked like wolves, like monsters, like the ghosts of everything he had run away from. They had been walking for 20 minutes in the timber when David realized the terrifying truth. He was lost. The landmarks were buried. The familiar trail markers, the blazed trunks, the specific rock formations, were all erased by the storm and the dark. Every direction looked the same, just endless trunks and white snow. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his throat. If they wandered in circles here, they would die. They would be found in the spring, 3 frozen husks huddled together under a spruce tree. He stopped, desperate, swinging the light around. "Which way?" he whispered to himself. "Think, David. Think." He looked at the slope, but the ground here was undulating, confusing. He looked for the stars, but the canopy blocked them. Suddenly, the weight in his arms shifted. Elias, who had been comatose since the plateau, lifted his head. It was a slow, heavy movement, like a stone rising from the bottom of a lake. The bobcat let out a sound, not a growl, not a hiss, but a sharp, chirping bark. A sound David had never heard before. The animal twisted in David's grip, struggling to free his front paws. "Easy," David murmured. "I've got you." But Elias ignored him. He stretched his neck out, his nose working the air, sniffing intently at something David couldn't smell. The single amber eye, clouded with death, was fixed on a gap between 2 massive boulders to their left, a direction David had dismissed as a dead end. The bobcat barked again, louder this time, and dug his claws into David's parka, pulling toward the rocks. "He knows," Martha whispered from behind him. Her voice was faint, but lucid. "He smells it." "Smells what?" David asked. "It's just snow." "He smells the scent marks," Martha said. "He marked the burnt oak every day for 15 years. It's his boundary line. He knows where his kingdom ends." David looked at the dark gap between the boulders. It looked impenetrable, a black maw leading into nowhere. But then he looked at the animal in his arms. Elias was trembling, not with cold, but with a magnetic pull. The dying king was orienting himself to his throne. "Okay," David breathed. "Okay, old man. You lead." He turned and walked toward the boulders, trusting the nose of a dying animal over his own human logic. He squeezed through the gap, the rocks scraping against his jacket. On the other side, the trees suddenly thinned. The ground rose sharply one last time. And there, silhouetted against the faint, storm-clouded light of the night sky, stood a massive, skeletal shape. It was the burnt oak. It was a monument to survival. Struck by lightning decades ago, half of it was blackened charcoal, dead and jagged. But the other half was still alive, twisting defiantly toward the sky, its branches gnarled and thick. It stood at the very edge of a sheer drop-off, overlooking the entire valley. They had made it. David stumbled forward, his legs finally giving out as the adrenaline crashed. He fell to his knees at the base of the tree, the snow here blown thin by the wind. "We're here," David choked out, tears streaming down his face, freezing instantly. "Mom, we're here." Martha crawled up beside him. She didn't look at the view. There was no view tonight, only a wall of white swirling snow. She reached out and touched the rough, charred bark of the tree. "His place," she whispered. David looked down at Elias. The bobcat had stopped struggling. He was looking up at the tree, his ears perked forward. The tension left his body. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. He was home. But as David looked closer, shining the light on the animal's face, he saw the change. The amber eye was losing its focus. The breathing was spacing out. Gaps of 5 seconds, then 10 seconds. He waited, David realized, a sob catching in his throat. He waited until we got here. Put him up, Martha said. Her voice was strong now, fueled by the finality of the moment. Put him on the branch. Don't let him die on the ground. David nodded. He stood up, his muscles screaming in protest. He approached the lowest branch of the oak, a thick limb that extended out over the drop-off, about chest height. He lifted Elias. The bobcat was limp, heavy with the weight of impending death. David placed him gently onto the rough bark. And then, the miracle happened. As his paws touched the wood of his throne, Elias engaged. The claws that had been useless for days extended, digging into the bark. The muscles in his shoulders bunched. With a groan of effort that sounded almost human, the paralyzed bobcat dragged his torso upright. He couldn't stand, his back legs were gone, but he hauled himself into a sitting position, bracing his chest against the main trunk. He sat there, a silhouette of ruin and majesty, facing the invisible valley, facing the storm. He adjusted his front paws, crossing them slightly, the pose of a sphinx. He wasn't just dying, he was presiding. David stepped back, his arm around his mother, supporting her weight. They stood in the presence of something ancient and holy. The storm raged around them, but under the branches of the burnt oak, there was a pocket of stillness. Elias took a breath. It rattled in his chest. He didn't exhale. David waited. 1 second, 2, 3. The wind caught the fur on the bobcat's ruff, ruffling it gently. The head did not bow. The eye did not close. He simply ceased. He died sitting up. He died watching his world. David felt his mother sag against him, a heavy sob breaking from her chest. But he didn't look away. He watched as the snow began to settle on the bobcat's shoulders, turning the black spotted fur white, beginning the process of transformation. The king was dead. Long live the king. The silence that followed the death of a king was heavier than the storm. It was a vacuum that sucked the sound out of the wind, leaving only the beating of David's own heart, erratic and loud in his ears. Elias sat on the branch of the burnt oak, immovable. The wind, which had fought them every step of the way, now seemed to accept his presence. It swirled around the dead bobcat, depositing fine grains of ice into the hollows of his fur, dusting his eyelashes with white, beginning the slow, inevitable work of turning flesh into landscape. David stood back, his arm wrapped tightly around his mother's waist. He expected her to collapse. He expected the wailing grief that he had seen so many times in the clinic waiting rooms, the denial, the bargaining, the jagged sobs of loss. But Martha did not scream. She did not reach out to shake the body, begging it to wake up. She simply stood there, swaying slightly in the gale, her eyes fixed on the silhouette of the animal she had shared her life with for nearly 2 decades. "He looks bigger," Martha whispered. Her voice was not a sob, but a statement of wonder. David looked. She was right. In life, Elias had been shrunken by age and illness, his spine prominent, his muscles wasted. But now, sitting rigid against the trunk, frozen in his final pose of vigilance, he looked massive. The pain was gone from his posture. The desperation was gone. What remained was pure, distilled wildness. "He isn't suffering anymore," David said, the words feeling inadequate, like trying to bandage a canyon. "No," Martha agreed. She stepped away from David's support, moving closer to the tree. "He is just waiting." She reached up. David tensed, afraid she would try to pull the body down, try to carry the corpse back to the cabin. That would be a disaster. A dead body was dead weight, impossible to maneuver down the ice chute without killing them both. But Martha didn't pull. She took off her heavy leather glove, exposing her bare hand to the biting cold. She reached out and placed her palm on the bobcat's flank. She held it there for a long moment, ignoring the freeze that must have been searing her skin. "You were a good friend." She spoke to the ice, her voice steady and clear. "You were a terrible houseguest. You were a stubborn patient. But you were a good friend." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against the animal's cold shoulder. It was a gesture of intimacy so private that David felt he should look away, but he couldn't. He witnessed the transfer of warmth, the final connection breaking. "Go find your valley," she whispered. "No fences now, no traps, just running." She pulled back. She put her glove back on, her movements slow and deliberate. When she turned to face David, her face was streaked with frozen tears, but her jaw was set. "We leave him," she said. David blinked, surprised by her resolve. "Are you sure? We could try to cover him with branches." "No." Martha looked at the snow piling up on the bobcat's shoulders. "The snow will cover him. By morning, he will be part of the tree. That's how it should be. He belongs to the winter now." She looked at David, and for the first time that night, the fog of hypothermia seemed to have lifted completely, burned away by the sheer intensity of the grief. "And we belong to the living, David. If we stay here another 10 minutes, we will be joining him." David checked his internal clock. She was right. The adrenaline that had fueled their ascent was crashing. The cold was beginning to gnaw at his own bones now. His toes were numb blocks of wood. His fingers were clumsy. The descent would be infinitely more dangerous than the climb. Going up, they had a mission to drive them. Going down, they had nothing but emptiness and exhaustion. "Okay," David said. "Let's go home." He took the lead this time. He didn't want his mother to have to look back. He grabbed her arm, interlocking his elbow with hers, binding them together. They turned their backs on the burnt oak. The first step away was the hardest. It felt like a betrayal, leaving him there, alone in the dark, while they walked back toward warmth and light. David could feel the weight of the bobcat's absence pressing on his back. He fought the urge to turn around, to check if Elias had moved, if he had changed his mind. But the forest demanded their attention. The tracks they had made coming up were already gone, filled in by the relentless drift. The ghost forest was a blank slate once again. "Stay in my footprints," David shouted over the wind. "Use the holes I make." The descent was a nightmare of a different breed. Without the burden of the bobcat in his arms, David's center of gravity was different. And he found himself overcompensating, slipping on the hidden slick spots. Gravity, which had been an enemy on the ascent, was now a treacherous friend, pulling them down faster than they could control. They reached the gap in the boulders, the portal Elias had found. David squeezed through, helping Martha after him. As she emerged from the rocks, Martha stumbled. Her knee buckled, and she went down hard into the powder. "Mom!" David hauled her up. "I'm tired, David," she mumbled, her head lolling forward. The lucid strength at the tree was fading, replaced by the crushing fatigue of the return journey. "I just need to sit for a minute." "No sitting," David said, his voice harsh with fear. "You sit, you die. That's the rule." "Just a minute," she pleaded, her eyes drifting shut. "It's downhill. We can slide." David looked at her. She was at the limit. The reserves were gone. He looked back at the dark gap in the rocks. He thought of Elias, sitting eternally vigilant on his branch. Elias wouldn't sit, David said, invoking the only name that mattered. He walked on 3 legs for 3 miles to get home after that trap. You told me that story. You told me he never stopped. Martha's eyes snapped open. He kept moving, David pressed, shaking her. Are you weaker than him? Are you going to let him win? It was a cruel challenge, but it worked. Oh, spark of indignation flared in Martha's eyes. He was a show-off, she grumbled, forcing her legs to straighten. Always had to be the tough one. Then show him, David said, pulling her forward. Show him you're tough too. They moved out of the timber and onto the exposed plateau. The wind hit them like a physical hammer, trying to knock them off the mountain. Without the trees to break it, the gale was terrifying. It screamed across the granite, stinging their faces with ice pellets that felt like birdshot. David kept his head down, navigating by memory and the faint gray shape of the slope. He counted steps. 1, 2, 3. Don't think about the cold. 4, 5. Don't think about the empty house waiting below. At the top of the ice chute, the place where he had fallen, the place where Elias had been humiliated, David paused. The descent here was essentially a controlled fall. We have to slide, David yelled. It's too steep to walk. I'll go first. You hold on to my feet. We go down like a toboggan. Martha didn't argue. She lacked the energy to argue. She lay down in the snow behind him, grabbing the cuffs of his pants. Go, she said. David pushed off. They slid down the darkness. It was a chaotic, terrifying rush. Snow flew into David's face, blinding him. He used his elbows and boots as brakes, digging into the crust, steering them away from the drop-off on the left. They picked up speed, tumbling over the spot where the cornice had broken, sliding over the buried memories of their struggle an hour ago. They came to a halt at the bottom of the chute, in a drift of deep, soft powder. David lay there for a second, gasping, staring up at the sky. The clouds were breaking. Just for a second, a single star appeared through the rift, cold, distant, and brilliant. He looked back. Martha was lying still. Mom? She groaned and rolled over. I'm here. I'm still here. We're past the hard part, David said, though he knew the mile-long trudge through the deep snow of the lower forest was still ahead. It's just walking now. He helped her up. She was trembling violently now, her body convulsing in shivers. This was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting, still trying to generate heat. As they walked the final mile, something changed in the atmosphere. The wind began to die down. The storm, having claimed its prize, was losing interest in the survivors. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the ascent. It was a hollow, echoing silence. David looked at the trees passing by. He remembered the photo of Elias on the porch. He remembered the story of the branding iron. He looked at his mother, limping along beside him, a woman he thought he knew, but was only just beginning to understand. He realized that he was walking down this mountain a different man than the one who had walked up. He had gone up as a doctor, a man of science who believed in fixing things, in controlling outcomes. He was coming down as a witness. He had witnessed a mystery that science couldn't explain. The bond between species, the currency of respect, the power of a good death. They broke through the final line of trees. The cabin sat in the clearing below, its windows dark, its chimney smokeless. It looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the immense white wilderness. We made it, David whispered. Martha stopped. She didn't look at the house. She turned around and looked back up toward the invisible ridge, toward the burnt oak hidden in the night. She raised her hand in a small, silent wave. "Good night, Elias," she said softly. Then, leaning heavily on her son, she turned and walked the last 100 yards toward the empty door. The door to the mudroom latching shut was the loudest sound in the world. It severed the connection to the howling wind outside, replacing the chaotic roar of the storm with a stillness that felt heavy, pressurized, and suffocating. David leaned his back against the rough wood of the door, sliding down until he hit the floor. His legs, which had carried him up a mountain and down again, finally declared bankruptcy. He sat there in the dark mudroom, listening to the ragged rasp of his mother's breathing beside him. The air here was only slightly warmer than outside, but it smelled of dry boots and old canvas, the smell of safety. "We need to get the wet clothes off," David said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hoarse, cracked, a stranger's voice. Martha didn't answer immediately. She was staring at her hands, still encased in the thick, frozen leather gloves. She looked like a statue that had been toppled from its plinth. "Mom, I'm cold, David," she whispered. "I'm so cold." The adrenaline had fully receded, leaving behind the true cost of the journey. The hypothermia was clawing at the door again. David forced himself up. His joints popped like dry twigs. He reached down and began to unbutton his mother's coat. His fingers were clumsy, numb blocks of meat fumbling with the stiff toggles. But he worked with a desperate focus. He stripped the frozen sheepskin from her shoulders. It fell to the floor with a heavy thud, a sound that made them both flinch. It was the coat that had carried Elias. It still held the shape of his body in its folds. David guided her into the main room. The fire he had built hours ago, or was it a lifetime ago, had burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing coals. The room was dim, illuminated only by the dying red light. He steered Martha to the rocking chair, but she stopped. She stood in the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the buffalo hide rug in front of the hearth. It was empty. For 19 years, that rug had been occupied. It had been the throne of the king. It was where Elias groomed himself, where he slept, where he watched the flames with half-closed eyes. The depression of his weight was still visible in the fur, a ghostly crater of matted hair. A few tufts of spotted fur still clung to the edges. The absence was physical. It hit David in the chest like a physical blow. The room felt enormous. It felt wrong. The balance of the house had shifted, tilting on its axis now that its center of gravity was gone. "He's not here," Martha said. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that was just now, finally landing with its full weight. "Sit down, Mom," David urged gently, pulling the rocking chair closer to the fire. "I need to build up the heat." She sat. She didn't rock. She just sat rigid, staring at the empty rug. David went to work. He shoved kindling into the coals, blowing on them until a flame caught. He piled on split logs, feeding the fire until it roared, casting dancing shadows against the log walls. The heat washed over them, stinging their frozen skin. The thaw was agonizing. As the blood rushed back into David's extremities, it brought with it a sensation of burning needles. He hissed through his teeth, rubbing his hands together. He looked at his mother. She was wincing, her eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking out. "It hurts," she murmured. "I know," David said, going to the kitchen to fill the kettle. "That means you're alive. The pain is good." He moved around the kitchen, the familiar domestic sounds, the clink of the kettle, the rush of the tap, the strike of a match for the stove, seeming absurdly mundane after what they had just witnessed. How could the stove still work? How could the water still run? Didn't the house know that the world had ended? He made tea, heavy with sugar, and brought a mug to his mother. He knelt beside her, wrapping her cold hands around the hot ceramic. "Drink," he ordered. She took a sip, the steam fogging her glasses. She swallowed, and some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. She looked at David. Really looked at him. For the first time since they had come down. "You carried him," she said softly. "You carried him all the way." "He let me," David corrected. "He didn't have a choice. He always had a choice." Martha shook her head. "He could have taken your hand off. He let you carry him because he knew." "Knew what?" "That you are part of the pack," Martha said. She took another sip of tea. "He never trusted anyone but me. Not in 19 years. But he trusted you tonight." David looked at the empty rug. The shame he had felt on the mountain, the jealousy of the son replaced by the beast, was gone. In its place was a quiet pride. He had been accepted. He had been knighted by the king in his final hour. "I'm sorry I threw the needle away," David said, a sudden confession. "I should have. I don't know. It was professional misconduct." Martha let out a short, dry laugh. It was a rusty sound, but it was human. "If you had given him that shot, David, I would have never forgiven you. And I would have never forgiven myself. You didn't throw away a medical tool. You threw away a mistake." She leaned back in the chair, the heat finally penetrating her core. Her eyes drifted to the sliding glass door, the glass that Elias had scratched in his final, desperate bid for freedom. The claw marks were faintly visible in the reflection of the firelight, jagged white scars on the pane. "I'm going to leave those," Martha said, following his gaze. "I'm never cleaning that glass." "You don't have to," David said. The silence returned, but it had changed texture. It was no longer the terrifying silence of the ghost forest. It was the silence of a house that was resting. The storm outside was finally breaking. The wind had dropped to a low moan in the chimney. David stood up and walked to the window. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, looking out into the darkness where the burnt oak stood invisible in the night. "What do you do now?" David asked, his back to her. "Tomorrow. Next week. What do you do without him?" It was the question that had terrified him enough to try and force her to move to Seattle years ago. The thought of her alone in this vast wilderness, without her protector, without her companion. "I wake up," Martha answered simply. "I make coffee. I feed the chickens. I watch the sun come up over the ridge." "Alone?" David said. "No," Martha said. David turned around. "He's not gone, David," Martha said, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "Did you feel the wind when he died? Did you see the way the snow covered him? He went back into the ground. He went back into the trees. Every time the wind blows through the pines, that's him. Every time a deer gets spooked in the meadow, that's him." She looked at the empty rug with a gaze that was clear and devoid of pity. "He gave me 19 years of his life. I gave him a good death. That is a complete circle. There is nothing missing." David looked at his mother. He had always seen her as a stubborn old woman clinging to a hard life. Now, he saw her as she was, a priestess of this high, cold country. She didn't need his pity. She didn't need rescuing. But she did need a son. "I'm going to stay for a while," David said. The decision came out fully formed, surprising him. "I have vacation time stored up. A lot of it. I can fix the roof. I can help you clear the trail to the oak when the snow melts." Martha looked at him. Her eyes softened, the blue returning to them as the blood returned to her face. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say that would be nice. Those were city words. She simply nodded. "The roof does need work," she said, "and the woodpile is getting low." "I'll get on it tomorrow," David said. He walked over and sat on the floor, not on the rocking chair, but on the edge of the buffalo rug, near where the fire was warmest. He sat in the space where the guardian used to sit. He wasn't trying to replace him. He was just keeping the spot warm. Martha reached down and rested her hand on David's shoulder. It was a heavy, grounding weight. Outside, the clouds parted, revealing a moon that turned the snow-covered world into a landscape of silver and blue. High on the ridge, under the branches of a blackened tree, a snow-covered mound sat watching over them, silent and eternal. The house was empty of the beast, but for the first time in 20 years, it was full of family. Dawn arrived not with warmth, but with a blinding, revelationary brightness. The storm, having spent its fury in the night, had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving behind a dome of piercing, saturated blue that seemed brittle enough to crack. David woke on the buffalo rug. He hadn't meant to sleep there, but exhaustion had claimed him before he could move to the couch. His body was a landscape of aches. Every muscle from his calves to his shoulders screamed in protest as he sat up. His hands, raw from the cold and the climbing, were stiff claws that refused to unclench fully. He looked around the cabin. The fire was dead, reduced to a heap of gray ash. The room was cold, the air hanging still and suspended. In the bedroom, the door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the deep, rhythmic breathing of his mother. She was alive. She was resting. That was the only miracle that mattered this morning. David stood up, his joints popping audibly in the quiet room. He walked to the sliding glass door, the one with the scratches. The view took his breath away. The world had been erased and redrawn in white. The snow was impossibly deep, burying the fence posts, smoothing the jagged contours of the woodpile into soft, rolling mounds. The sun, just cresting the eastern peaks, fired the snow crystals into a billion microscopic diamonds. It was beautiful in a way that hurt the eyes. He looked up toward the ridge. The burnt oak was visible now, a stark black skeleton against the blue sky. It looked small from here, just a mark of charcoal on a white canvas. David squinted, trying to see the branch, trying to see the shape of the king. But the distance was too great. Or perhaps the snow had already done its work, covering the body, merging the animal with the wood and the ice. Elias was part of the mountain now. Literally. David turned away from the window. He didn't feel sadness. He felt a strange, vibrating clarity. The frantic urgency of the night before seemed like a fever dream. This was reality. The cold floor, the empty wood box, the silence. He knew what he had to do. He didn't need a medical chart or a schedule. The cabin dictated the schedule. He pulled on his boots, his heavy coat, still damp from the trek, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp and metallic, tasting of ozone and pine needles. The first task was the path. David found the snow shovel leaning against the wall. He stepped off the porch, sinking to his knees, and began to dig. It was brutal, repetitive work. Lift, twist, throw, lift, twist, throw. The snow was heavy, packed dense by the wind. At first, his mind raced with thoughts of Seattle, of his clinic, his appointments, the emails piling up in his inbox. But as the rhythm of the work took over, those thoughts began to dissolve. The physical exertion demanded his total presence. You couldn't worry about a mortgage in the city when you were trying to clear a path to the woodshed. Sweat broke out on his forehead, freezing instantly in the air. He stripped off his coat, working in his flannel shirt, steam rising from his shoulders like smoke. He cleared the path to the shed, then the path to the chicken coop. He found the birds huddled together for warmth, clucking indignantly at the delay in their breakfast. He fed them, scattering the grain with a hand that felt strangely steady. Then came the wood. The pile on the porch was gone. David walked to the main stack, grabbed the splitting maul, and set a round of lodgepole pine on the chopping block. He raised the maul. He didn't think about the arc. He felt it. The steel head came down. The wood split with a sharp, cracking report that echoed off the valley walls, a gunshot of industry in the silence. Split, stack, split, stack. It was a meditation. With every swing, David felt himself rooting deeper into the ground. He understood now why Martha had never left. In the city, you worked for money, for status, for the future. Here you worked to stay warm, you worked to eat. The relationship between effort and survival was direct, honest, and immediate. You're swinging it wrong. David froze, the maul raised mid-swing. He turned. Martha was standing on the porch. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, clutching a mug of coffee. She looked frail, her face pale and etched with the trauma of the night. But her eyes were clear. They were the blue of the sky, sharp and observant. "Am I?" David lowered the maul, wiping sweat from his eyes. "You're using your shoulders," Martha said, her voice raspy but amused. "You have to use your hips. Let the tool do the work. You're fighting the wood. You need to work with it." David laughed. It was a genuine sound, startling a jay in the nearby pine. "I thought I was doing pretty good. For a city doctor, maybe." Martha stepped down from the porch. She was wearing her boots, unlaced. She walked over to him, the blanket trailing in the snow. She reached out and adjusted his grip on the handle. Her hands were warm. "Slide your hand down as you swing," she instructed. "Like this. Snap your wrists at the end." David nodded. He set another log. He tried it her way. Up, slide, snap. The log didn't just split. It exploded apart, 2 clean halves falling to the snow. The sound was different, deeper, more resonant. "Better." Martha nodded. She looked at the pile of wood he had already split. "That's enough for 2 days. I'm going to fill the porch," David said. "And then I'm going to fix the roof shingles that blew off in the storm." Martha looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the sweat on his shirt, the blisters forming on his hands, the way he stood with his feet planted wide in the snow. She didn't ask him how long he was staying. She didn't ask him about his job. She simply accepted his labor. "There's stew in the freezer," she said. "Venison. I'll put it on the stove." "Sounds good," David said. She turned to go back inside, but paused at the door. She looked up at the ridge, shielding her eyes against the glare. She stood there for a full minute, silent, communicating with the ghost on the mountain. "The crows are circling," she said softly. David looked up. High above the burnt oak, black specks were wheeling in the blue sky. Scavengers. Nature's cleanup crew. A pang of protectiveness shot through David. "I should have buried him." "No," Martha said firmly. "He fed on this mountain for 19 years. Now he feeds the mountain. It is a gift, David. It is the final gift." She turned back to him. "He isn't there anymore, anyway. That's just the shell." She went inside, the screen door slapping shut behind her. David stood alone in the yard. He looked up at the circling birds. He thought about the cycle of it all. The deer ate the grass. Elias ate the deer. Now the birds would eat Elias. And eventually, the birds would die and feed the soil that grew the grass. It wasn't cruel. It was perfect. It was a system that had no waste, no pity, and no end. He picked up the maul again. He felt the weight of the steel, the texture of the hickory handle. He felt the soreness in his back, a good, honest pain that told him he was alive. He swung. The wood cracked. For the first time in 20 years, David didn't feel like he was visiting. He felt like he was home. He wasn't the king of this valley. That title would always belong to the one-eyed cat on the ridge. But he could be its steward. He could be the hands that chopped the wood and fixed the roof. He could be the sun who stayed. He worked until the sun was high overhead, until his muscles trembled and his stomach growled. He worked until the pile of wood was a fortress against the cold. As he carried the last armful onto the porch, he glanced at the window, the one with the scratch marks. The light caught the jagged grooves in the glass. They looked like a signature. David smiled. He stacked the wood carefully, leaving a clear view of the scratches. He would never polish them out. They were part of the house now. They were the history of the place, written in diamond-hard determination. He dusted the bark from his shirt, stomped the snow from his boots, and opened the door. The smell of venison stew and wood smoke rushed out to meet him, the perfume of survival. He stepped inside, closing the door against the bright, silent afternoon. Spring in the Montana high country did not arrive politely. It crashed into the valley with the violence of a dam breaking. The silence of the winter was replaced by a cacophony of life. The roar of the creek swollen with meltwater, the bugling of returning elk, and the aggressive percussion of woodpeckers hammering into the pines. It was late May. The snow was gone, leaving behind meadows of knee-high bunchgrass that rippled like a green ocean in the warm breeze. David stood by his truck, the bed loaded with his duffel bags and tools. He looked different than the man who had arrived in a blizzard 4 months ago. The pallor of the city operating room was gone, replaced by a deep, wind-burnished tan. His hands, resting on the tailgate, were rough, calloused, and stained with the resin of chopped pine. He had fixed the roof. He had rebuilt the fence. He had cleared the fire break. He was ready to go back to Seattle. His leave of absence was over. The clinic called. "You checked the oil?" Martha asked. She was standing on the porch, leaning against the railing. She looked stronger, too. The winter had tried to take her, but like the roots of the old cedar, she had held on. "Checked it twice," David said, "and I filled the propane tank. You're good until October." "I know," Martha said. She didn't say, "I'll miss you." She didn't have to. "I have time for one last walk," David said, glancing up at the ridge. Martha smiled, a small, knowing expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Go on then. Check the property line." David turned and walked toward the tree line. The trail, which had been a vertical tomb of ice in February, was now a soft path of pine needles and damp earth. He didn't need to struggle. He walked with the easy, swinging gait of a man who knew the terrain. He passed the gap in the boulders where Elias had guided them. He remembered the terror of the ghost forest, the way the shadows had twisted into monsters. Now, sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating patches of blue columbine and wild strawberry. He reached the plateau. The wind was still there. It was always there. But today it carried the scent of sagebrush and warming mud, not ice. He walked to the burnt oak. The tree stood sentinel over the valley, its charred half black and stark, its living half exploding with new green needles. David approached the lower branch, the throne. There was no body. Nature was efficient. The coyotes, the ravens, the beetles, and the wind had done their work. Elias had been dismantled and returned to the carbon cycle. All that remained were a few tufts of gray-white fur caught in the rough bark of the oak, fluttering like prayer flags in the breeze. And on the ground below, bleached white by the high-altitude sun, lay a single curved rib bone. David picked it up. It was light, porous, stripped of all pain and weight. He held it for a moment, thinking of the 120 pounds of fighting spirit that had once wrapped around it. "You made it, old man," David whispered. "You're part of the view now." He placed the bone back on the earth, near the roots. He didn't bury it. Burial was for humans, for creatures who wanted to be separated from the dirt. Elias wanted to be the dirt. David sat down on a nearby rock, taking a moment to imprint the view into his mind before he returned to the concrete canyons of the city. He watched a hawk circling the thermal currents below. He breathed in the thin, clean air. Snap. The sound came from the brush to his right. It wasn't the heavy crash of a deer or the frantic rustle of a squirrel. It was a deliberate, calculated placement of weight. David froze. He didn't turn his head. He moved only his eyes. 10 yards away, emerging from the shadow of a subalpine fir, was a cat. It wasn't Elias. It was smaller, perhaps 30 pounds, with a coat that was more brown than gray, the spots vivid and dark against the tawny fur. It was young, a male, judging by the breadth of the head. His ear tufts were long and sharp, unscarred by battle. He moved with the fluid, liquid grace of a creature that had never known a cage or leash. The young bobcat stopped. He had seen David. He didn't run. That was the surprise. A normal wild cat would have vanished the instant it sensed a human. But this one stood his ground. He lifted a paw, holding it suspended in the air, his golden eyes locking onto David's face. He wasn't afraid. He was curious. And beneath the curiosity, there was a flicker of arrogance. He looked at David. Then he looked at the burnt oak. He looked at the tufts of gray fur caught in the bark. He sniffed the air, his nose working, processing the lingering scent of the old king. Then, with a dismissal that was almost insulting, the young cat walked past David. He didn't slink. He strutted. He walked right up to the burnt oak. He sniffed the trunk. He turned around, presenting his back to the tree, and sprayed it. A fresh mark. A new claim. Then, in a move that made the hair on David's arms stand up, the young cat leaped. He landed on the exact same branch where Elias had died. He settled himself, tucking his paws under his chest, and then looked out over the valley. He sat in the exact same silhouette. The ears perked forward, the spine straight, the gaze imperious. David let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The valley didn't tolerate a vacuum. The throne had been vacant for 4 months. It had been claimed. David stood up slowly. The young cat turned his head, his eyes narrowing. He let out a low, warning hiss. "This is mine." "You are a guest?" David smiled. He raised a hand in a gesture of respect. "Long live the king," David whispered. He backed away. He didn't turn his back until he was in the tree line. He left the new monarch to his watch. When David got back to the cabin, Martha was waiting by the truck. She had a small Tupperware container in her hands, leftover stew for the drive. "You were up there a while," she said. "I met the new tenant," David said, taking the container. Martha didn't look surprised. She looked at the ridge, her expression serene. "The young male with the dark spots?" "I saw him near the chicken coop last week. He's bold. Too bold. He needs to learn manners." David laughed. "He reminds me of someone." "He's nothing like Elias," Martha scoffed, though her voice was affectionate. Elias had dignity, This one is just a punk. Give him time, David said. The mountain teaches everyone eventually. He walked around to the driver's side of the truck. He opened the door, but paused before getting in. He looked at the house, the logs he had chinked, the roof he had shingled. It wasn't a dying old woman's house anymore. It was a fortress. I'll be back for elk season in October, David said. I'll bring a new splitter for the wood. Don't bring a machine, Martha warned. It makes you lazy. Bring your arms. Yes, ma'am. David climbed into the truck. He started the engine. He rolled down the window. Mom, he said. Go, David. She waved him off. Traffic in Spokane is going to be terrible. He put the truck in gear and rolled slowly down the driveway. As he passed the front of the cabin, the afternoon sun hit the sliding glass door at a sharp angle. The scratches were blazing in the light. David stopped the truck for a second. He looked at the jagged white lines etched into the glass. Most people would see damage. They would see a ruined pane of glass that needed to be replaced to improve the property value. But David saw a map. The vertical lines were the climb, the struggle, the pain, the impossible ascent against gravity. The horizontal lines were the peace, the horizon, the ridge, the final rest. It was a complete story, written by a claw that refused to be retracted. David smiled, a deep, settling feeling in his chest. He wasn't leaving the story behind. He was taking the ink with him. He touched the scar on his own hand, a small blister from the axe handle that had finally healed into a callus. It was his own mark, his own scratch on the glass. He looked at his mother one last time. She was standing on the porch, not alone, never alone. She was standing in the shadow of the mountain, and somewhere up there, a new set of amber eyes was watching over her. David stepped on the gas. The truck kicked up a cloud of dust, golden in the sunlight, as he headed back toward the world of pavement and noise, carrying the silence of the high country in his heart. There is an old saying in the high country, "A cage is safe, but a cage is not a life." Martha made her choice that night. She chose a hard death over an easy captivity. She chose to respect the king rather than pity the patient. Now, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments below. If you were standing in that cabin with the syringe in your hand, would you have opened that door? Would you have let him go into the storm, or would you have kept him safe inside? There is no wrong answer, but I really want to know what your heart would choose. If this story touched your spirit, please consider subscribing to our channel. We are building a community here that honors the deep, unspoken bond between humans and animals. A bond that goes beyond words. And don't go anywhere just yet. If you loved Elias, you need to meet Soldier, a blind horse who taught a broken veteran how to see again. That story is on your screen right now. Click it and let's take another walk together.